Voor 10 years, I sefardine si until I decided to bry far. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought I was helping my family. But somewhere along the way, helping became suffering. Free and love became a prison I built with my own hands. For 10 long years, I watched my independence disappear $1, one decision, one piece of my dignity at a time. They told me it was for my own good. They told me I was too old to manage alone. They told me so many lies that I almost forgot the truth about who I was. My name is Margaret, I'm 68 years old. And this is the story of how I nearly lost everything, including myself, before I found the courage to take my life back. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. 10 years ago, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. I had just buried my husband Robert after 42 beautiful years of marriage. The grief was crushing, yes, but I felt blessed to have had such love in my life. Our little house on Maple Street, with its white picket fence and rose garden that Robert had tended so carefully, felt enormous and empty without him. The silence was deafening. That's when my son David called. "Mom," he said, and I could hear the worry in his voice. "Susan and I have been talking. We don't think you should be alone right now. What if something happens? What if you fall? Or have a medical emergency?" David was 32 then, married to Susan for 3 years. They'd been renting a small apartment across town, and I knew money was tight for them. David had always been my dreamer, full of big plans and grand ideas, but not always the best with follow-through. Still, he was my only child, and I loved him fiercely. "I'm managing just fine, sweetheart," I told him that day, though truthfully, the loneliness was eating at me. The house felt like a museum of memories, every corner holding echoes of Robert's laughter. "But what if you're not?" Susan's voice came through the phone. David had put me on speaker. "David and I lose sleep every night worrying about you. We love you so much. Mom Chen." She'd started calling me Mom Chen right after their wedding, and it always warmed my heart. "What if we moved in with you, just temporarily? Just until you're feeling stronger?" I remember standing in my kitchen that autumn day, looking out at Robert's roses beginning their winter sleep, free, and feeling something I hadn't felt since the funeral: hope. The idea of having family around, of hearing voices and footsteps in the house again, of not eating dinner alone every single night. It sounded like a lifeline. "It would just be for a few months?" David added quickly. "Just until we get back on our feet financially, and until you're feeling more like yourself again. A few months." That's what he said. "A few months. Well," I said slowly, "I suppose the house is certainly big enough. And it would be nice to have some company." The relief in their voices was immediate and overwhelming. "Oh, Mom, thank you so much," Susan gushed. "This is going to be so wonderful. We're going to take such good care of you." They moved in the following weekend. I remember how happy I felt, bustling around the house, preparing Robert's old study to be their bedroom. I cooked David's favorite meals, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the way I'd made it when he was little. I bought Susan's favorite tea, chamomile with honey, and fresh flowers for their room. For the first few weeks, it felt like the old days when David was young and the house was full of life. Susan would help me with groceries, though she did insist on driving. "Your reflexes aren't what they used to be, Mom Chen, and we just want you to be safe." David would fix little things around the house that I'd been meaning to get to, though he'd often start projects and not quite finish them. The first sign that something wasn't right came about a month after they moved in. I was paying bills at the kitchen table, the same way I'd done every month for decades. I had my checkbook out, my neat stack of envelopes, and my reading glasses perched on my nose. It was a ritual that gave me a sense of control and accomplishment. "What are you doing, Mom?" Susan asked, appearing suddenly behind me. "Just paying the monthly bills," I said, not looking up from writing a check to the electric company. "Oh, Mom Chen," she said, and her voice had this tone, like she was talking to a confused child. "You shouldn't be worrying about things like this anymore. You've done enough of that for a lifetime. Why don't you let us handle the finances? David's so good with numbers." I paused, pen in hand. "I appreciate the offer, dear, but I've been managing my own finances for nearly 50 years. I think I can handle it." Susan laughed, but it didn't sound quite right. "Of course you can. But wouldn't it be nice to not have to worry about it? We're living here now. We should be contributing, taking care of these things. It's the least we can do. David appeared in the doorway. Suzanne's right, Mom. You should be relaxing, enjoying your retirement. Let us take care of the boring stuff. Something in my chest tightened, but I couldn't put my finger on why. They were being kind, caring, they wanted to help, so why did I feel like I was losing something important? I like paying my bills, I said finally. It helps me keep track of my spending, my budget. I know where every penny goes. Exactly, Susan said brightly. That's so much stress! You don't need that kind of stress at your age. David and I can handle all of that, and you can just focus on enjoying life. At your age. The phrase stuck in my mind like a splinter. I was 58 years old, not 88. I was perfectly capable of writing checks and balancing a checkbook. But they looked so eager to help, so concerned about my well-being. And truthfully, part of me was tired. The grief of losing Robert had left me exhausted in ways I'd never experienced before. Maybe it would be nice to have fewer responsibilities for a while. I suppose, if you really want to help, I said hesitantly. The smiles that spread across their faces were radiant. Oh, Mom Chen, this is going to be so much better for you, Susan said, already gathering up my checkbook and bills. You just focus on healing and being happy. We'll take care of everything else. That night, I lay in my bed, the same bed I'd shared with Robert for decades, and stared at the ceiling. Something felt different about the house, about my place in it. But I pushed the feeling away. They were my family. They loved me. They were just trying to help. I had no idea that I'd just taken the first step down a path that would nearly destroy me. I had no idea that a few months would turn into years, and that helping would become controlling. And that love could be used as a weapon so sharp, I wouldn't even feel it cutting until I was already bleeding. All I knew that night was that the house felt full again. And after months of suffocating loneliness, that felt like enough. I should have trusted that tiny voice inside me that whispered something was wrong. I should have kept my checkbook. I should have said no, but I didn't. And that decision changed everything. The changes didn't happen all at once. If they had, I might have noticed sooner. But like a frog in slowly boiling water, I didn't realize how hot things had gotten until it was almost too late to jump out. It started with small things. Helpful things. Mom Chen? I noticed you were struggling to reach the top shelf in the kitchen, Susan said one morning about 6 weeks after they'd moved in. Why don't we rearrange things so everything you need is within easy reach? It seemed thoughtful. Practical even. So I watched as she moved my good china, the set Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary, to the very top shelf of the pantry. You won't be needing these for every day, she explained, and this way, the dishes you actually use are right here at eye level. My everyday dishes. When had my life been reduced to everyday dishes? When had my beautiful china become something I wouldn't be needing? But I said nothing. I told myself she was being considerate. The rearranging didn't stop in the kitchen. Within a month, they had helped me reorganize my entire house. My photo albums went into boxes in the basement. To protect them from dust and sunlight, my collection of first edition books that I'd spent 30 years building went into storage. To make room for more practical things. You've accumulated so much stuff over the years, Mom, David said as he carried down another box of my treasures. It's not healthy to be surrounded by so much clutter. Minimalism is better for your mental health. My life wasn't clutter. Those books weren't stuff. Each one held a memory, a moment of joy when I'd found it at a used bookstore or received it as a gift. Those photo albums chronicled decades of love and laughter. But watching my son label them as excess, as unhealthy accumulation, made me question my own judgment. Maybe I was holding on to too much. Maybe I was living in the past. The next change came with my social life. I had been part of a book club for 15 years. Every Tuesday, 6 of us would meet at the library where I'd worked as a librarian, and we'd discuss whatever novel we'd chosen that month. It was one of my greatest joys, the passionate debates about character motivations, the laughter when someone made a particularly witty observation, the way books opened up conversations about our own lives and experiences. I don't think you should be driving to those book club meetings anymore, Susan announced one Tuesday morning as I was getting ready to leave. Why not? I asked, pausing with my purse in hand. Well, your vision isn't what it used to be. And your reaction time, David and I worry about you driving, especially in the evening when it gets dark early. The meeting is at 2 in the afternoon, I said slowly. It's not dark at 2. But you might stay late, chatting with your friends. And then you'd be driving home in the dark. What if something happened? What if you had an accident? Her voice was full of concern, but something about it felt rehearsed, like she'd been practicing this conversation. I've been driving for 50 years, I said. I've never had an accident, but Mom Chen, she said, putting her hand on my arm, you're not 50 anymore. At some point, we all have to accept that we can't do everything we used to do. It's not your fault, it's just part of getting older. There it was again, at your age. Getting older. As if 58 was ancient, as if I should be grateful to still be breathing, let alone thinking I could drive to a book club. Maybe I could take you? David offered from the doorway. If you really want to go. That's very kind, I said, but you're at work on Tuesday afternoons. Well, I could take time off, if it's really that important to you. The way he said it, if it's really that important to you, made my book club sound trivial. Selfish even. Like I was asking him to sacrifice something significant, just so I could indulge in something frivolous. I don't want you to take time off work for me, I said. Then maybe you could skip it this week, Susan suggested. Just to be safe. 1 week became 2, 2 became 4. By the time I called my friend Helen, the book club leader, to explain why I'd been missing meetings, she told me they'd assumed I was no longer interested. We waited for you the first few weeks, she said, and I could hear the hurt in her voice. When you didn't call or anything, I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell her about Susan's concerns, about my son's willingness to sacrifice work time, about how complicated everything had become. But it sounded so foolish when I tried to put it into words. How could I explain that I'd stopped driving to book club because my daughter-in-law was worried about my vision, when I just renewed my license with no problems 6 months earlier? So I just apologized and said I'd been dealing with some family things. Helen was kind about it, but I could tell something had shifted between us. I was no longer Margaret, who never missed a meeting. I was Margaret, who disappeared without explanation. That night, I stood in my bedroom, though it was starting to feel less like my bedroom and more like a guest room in someone else's house, and looked at myself in the mirror. When had I started looking so small? When had my shoulders begun curving forward like I was trying to take up less space? The woman looking back at me wasn't the Margaret who had run a library for 20 years. She wasn't the Margaret who had organized community fundraisers and taught literacy classes to adults. She wasn't even the Margaret who had paid her own bills for 5 decades. This Margaret looked uncertain, tired, old, but I was still the same person, wasn't I? I still had the same mind, the same capabilities, the same dreams and opinions and desires. Right? The doubt was the worst part. Susan and David were so confident in their concerns, so certain that they knew what was best for me, that I started questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. Maybe my vision was getting worse. Maybe my reflexes were slower. Maybe I was becoming a danger to myself and others. Maybe they were right, and I was just too proud to admit it. 3 months turned into 6. 6 months turned into a year, and with each passing month, more of my independence slipped away, so gradually that I barely noticed until it was gone. I stopped going to my hairdresser because Susan said she could trim my hair at home. Why waste money when I'm perfectly capable? My hair, which had always been my pride, became shorter and more severe with each of Susan's trims. I stopped going to my doctor's appointments alone because David insisted on coming with me. To make sure you remember everything the doctor says. He would answer questions for me, interrupt when I was explaining symptoms, and speak to the doctor as if I weren't there. My physician, Dr. Martinez, whom I'd known for 15 years, started directing her questions to David instead of to me. I stopped making decisions about my own meals because Susan had taken over all the grocery shopping. I'm going anyway. And you don't need to be walking around that big store. She would return with foods I didn't particularly like, explaining that they were healthier for me, better for someone my age. By the end of that first year, I realized that I had become a guest in my own home. A dependent, a burden to be managed and protected from my own poor judgment. And the most terrifying part, I was starting to believe that's all I was. The woman who had once managed a staff of 12, who had organized community events, who had raised a son and maintained a marriage in a household, that woman was disappearing one small surrender at a time. I just didn't know how to stop it. I didn't even know if I wanted to anymore. Fighting seemed so exhausting, and they seemed so certain that they knew better. Maybe they did know better. Maybe this was just what getting older meant. Accepting that other people would make decisions for you, that your opinions mattered less, That your independence was something you could no longer afford. Maybe this was love. Maybe this was family. But if it was, why did it feel so much like dying while still breathing? The financial abuse started so subtly that I almost missed it entirely. Almost. It was during the second year they lived with me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once confidently paid my own bills, when I noticed something strange in my monthly bank statement. I wasn't supposed to be looking at bank statements anymore. Susan handled all of that now, along with everything else financial. But I'd found this one mixed in with some old magazines, and curiosity got the better of me. There were withdrawals I didn't recognize. Several of them, actually. ATM withdrawals for $200, $300, sometimes $500 at a time. I tried to remember making those withdrawals, but I couldn't. In fact, I couldn't remember the last time I'd even touched my ATM card. "Susan?" I called out, my voice tentative. I'd learned to be tentative about everything by then. "Could you come here for a moment?" She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What is it?" "Mom Chen." I held up the bank statement. "I found this, and there are some withdrawals I don't remember making. Could you help me understand?" The expression that flickered across Susan's face was so quick I almost missed it. Annoyance, maybe. Or was it something else? But then she smiled. And I thought I'd imagined it. "Oh, those," she said, sitting down beside me. "Don't you remember? You asked me to get cash for you for various things. Groceries, household expenses, things like that." "I did." I stared at the statement. "I don't remember." "Mom Chen," Susan said gently, placing her hand over mine, "you've been forgetting more things lately. David and I have noticed. It's perfectly normal at your age, but it's one of the reasons why it's so good that we're here to help you." My age. There it was again. That phrase that had become like a cage around my life. At your age, you shouldn't drive. At your age, you shouldn't handle money. At your age, you can't trust your own memory. 100, I said weakly. "That seems like a lot for groceries." "It wasn't just groceries," Susan explained patiently. "Remember? We also needed to pay the handyman to fix the leak under the kitchen sink. And we bought that new vacuum cleaner because your old one finally died. These things add up." "Mom Chen," I did remember the handyman vaguely, and my old vacuum had been making strange noises. But 500 still seemed like too much. Didn't it? "Of course," Susan continued. "If you'd rather handle the finances yourself again, you're welcome to. But you seemed so relieved when we took that burden off your shoulders. And honestly, with your memory being what it is lately all—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The implication hung in the air like smoke. "You can't trust yourself anymore. You need us. Without us, you'd make mistakes, forget things, mess everything up." I folded the bank statement and handed it back to her. "No, you're right. I'm sure you're handling everything perfectly." The smile she gave me was brilliant. "Of course I am, Mom Chen. That's what family is for." But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to remember asking Susan to withdraw that money, but the memory just wasn't there. Was my memory really getting that bad? Was I losing pieces of my own life without even realizing it? The doubt was worse than the confusion. At least confusion could be cleared up with answers. Doubt was like quicksand. The more you struggled against it, the deeper it pulled you down. Over the following months, I started paying more attention. Not obviously. I'd learned to be careful about questioning things too directly. But I watched, I listened, I noticed. I noticed that David had expensive new clothes, despite supposedly being between jobs. I noticed that Susan got her hair done at a salon that I knew charged $200 per visit. I'd priced it once years ago for a special occasion. I noticed that they went out to dinner frequently, came home with shopping bags from expensive stores, and seemed to always have cash when they needed it. Meanwhile, I was told that we needed to tighten the budget on my expenses. My prescription medications, which had always been fully covered by my insurance, suddenly required co-pays that Susan said we couldn't afford right now. My weekly grocery order was reduced to necessities only, though somehow those necessities never included the foods I actually enjoyed eating. "We all need to make sacrifices," Susan explained when I asked why we couldn't afford the good yogurt I'd always bought, the one that helped with my digestion. "Money is tight for everyone right now." But money wasn't tight for everyone. Money was tight for me. David and Susan seemed to have plenty for whatever they wanted. The breaking point came during their third year living with me. I was looking for a phone number in my old address book when I found something that stopped my heart cold. My credit card statement from the previous month. It had been mixed in with some old Christmas cards, probably by accident. The balance was over $8, and I stared at the number, certain there had been some mistake. I didn't use credit cards. Robert and I had always lived within our means, paid cash for everything we could, and kept our credit card only for true emergencies. I hadn't made a single purchase on that card in years. But there it was, line after line of charges. Restaurants I'd never been to, stores I'd never shopped at, online purchases I'd never made, all authorized with my card, my name, my account. My hands were shaking as I carried the statement to the living room, where David was watching television. "David?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to show you something." He looked up, saw the paper in my hands, and his expression changed instantly. For just a moment, I saw something I'd never seen before in my son's eyes: panic. But it was gone so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined it. "What's that, Mom?" he asked, though I could tell he already knew. "My credit card statement. There are charges on here I didn't make. Thousands of dollars worth of charges." David was quiet for a long moment. Then Susan appeared from the kitchen, as if she'd been listening from around the corner. "Oh, Mom Chen," she said, sitting down on my other side. "We were wondering when you'd find that." "When I'd find it," I repeated. "Of course we knew," David said. "Mom, we've been using your card for household expenses. For your expenses, for taking care of you. Taking care of me doesn't cost 8 sozo," I said, my voice rising for the first time in months. "These charges are for restaurants, clothing stores, Amazon purchases. All things for the household," Susan interrupted smoothly. "All things that benefit you directly or indirectly. The restaurant charges were when we bought takeout for you, because you weren't feeling well enough to cook. The clothing purchases were necessities we needed to continue living here and taking care of you. The Amazon orders were household supplies." "I don't remember any of this," I said desperately. "Mom," David said, and his voice was gentle but firm, "your memory has been getting worse. We've all noticed it. Sometimes we buy things for you and you forget within hours. Sometimes you ask us to order something and then have no memory of the conversation." "That's not true," I whispered. "Isn't it?" Susan asked. "Mom Chen, do you remember asking me to order you new sheets last month because yours were wearing out?" I stared at her. I didn't remember that. But I also didn't remember my sheets wearing out. "Do you remember asking David to pick up dinner from that Chinese place last week because you weren't feeling up to cooking?" I couldn't remember that either. "Do you remember telling us that you wanted us to have access to your credit card so we could take care of things for you without having to bother you every time?" No, I definitely didn't remember that conversation. But then again, there were a lot of conversations I couldn't remember clearly anymore. Weren't there? "The point is," David continued, "we're not stealing from you, Mom. We're taking care of you. Every dollar we spend is for your benefit, for your care, for keeping this household running so you can live comfortably in your own home." "But 8,000 no," I started. "Is a lot less than a nursing home would cost," Susan said quietly. The words hit me like a physical blow. Nursing home. Was that the alternative? Was that what would happen if I kept questioning them, kept making things difficult? "We don't want that for you, Mom Chen," Susan continued. "We love you. We want you to stay here in your own home with people who care about you, but that requires trust. That requires understanding that we're doing everything for your own good." I looked at my son, my baby boy who I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and tried to find the child I'd once known in his face. But all I saw was a stranger wearing David's features, saying words that sounded caring but felt like threats. I began then stopped. What was I trying to say? That I didn't trust them? That I thought they were stealing from me? How could I say that about my own family? "You just want to make sure everything is being handled properly," David finished for me. "And it is, Mom. I promise you, it is." But as I handed the credit card statement back to Susan, as I watched her fold it up and tuck it away where I'd never see it again, I realized something that terrified me more than any nursing home. I didn't believe him anymore. For the first time in 3 years, I was absolutely certain that my son was lying to me. And if he was lying about this, what else was he lying about? That night, alone in my bedroom, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to start keeping track. Quietly, carefully. But I was going to document everything I could remember, everything I noticed, everything that didn't feel right. I was going to find out what was really happening in my own life. Because if I couldn't trust my own family to tell me the truth, then I couldn't trust anyone. and that meant I was completely, utterly alone. I might have stayed trapped forever if it hadn't been for Eleanor Rodriguez. Ellie lived in the blue house next door, the one with the beautiful flower garden that bloomed in perfect succession from spring through fall. I'd seen her working in her yard over the years, always with a wide-brimmed hat and dirt under her fingernails, but we'd never been more than polite neighbors who waved hello across the fence. That changed on a Tuesday morning in October, during my 4th year of captivity, though I didn't think of it that way yet. I was sitting on my front porch, something I'd started doing when the walls of my own house began to feel like they were closing in on me. Susan and David were both out. David at what he claimed was a job interview, Susan at the grocery store, and for the first time in weeks, I had a few moments of peace. Beautiful morning, isn't it? I looked up to see Ellie standing at the edge of my yard, a steaming coffee mug in her hands. She was probably about my age, maybe a little older, with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Yes," I said, surprised to hear my own voice. I realized I hadn't spoken to anyone outside my house in days. "It really is. I hope you don't mind me saying," Ellie continued, taking a small step closer. "But I've been worried about you. I used to see you out in your garden all the time, and in recent years, well, I haven't seen much of you at all." Something inside my chest loosened at her words. Someone had noticed. Someone had been watching, caring, wondering where I'd gone. "I don't garden much anymore," I said carefully. I'd learned to be careful with my words, to not say anything that might get back to Susan and David and cause complications. "May I ask why?" Ellie's voice was gentle but direct, and something about her tone reminded me of the social workers I'd occasionally worked with at the library. Professional, compassionate, but not easily fooled. I opened my mouth to give the standard response. I was getting too old for gardening, my knees weren't what they used to be, Susan and David took such good care of the yard now. But looking at Ellie's kind, intelligent face, the lies stuck in my throat. "It's complicated," I said instead. Ellie studied me for a moment, then asked, "Would you mind if I joined you? I don't often get the chance to talk to neighbors anymore, and I'd love the company." I should have said no. I should have made some excuse about needing to go inside, about expecting company, about being too busy. That's what I'd been trained to do over the past 4 years. Deflect, avoid, keep interactions brief and meaningless. But I was so hungry for real conversation, for someone to see me as more than a problem to be managed, that I heard myself saying, "I'd like that very much." Ellie settled into the chair next to mine, Robert's old chair that no one had sat in for years, and for a few minutes we just sat together, watching the world wake up. It felt surprisingly natural, surprisingly right. "I used to be a social worker," Ellie said eventually. "Worked for 35 years with seniors and families in crisis. I retired about 10 years ago. But I guess you never really stopped seeing things through that lens." My heart started beating faster. A social worker. Someone who understood family dynamics, who might recognize. "What kind of things do you see?" I asked quietly. Ellie turned to look at me directly. "Margaret, it is Margaret, isn't it? I've noticed that you rarely leave your house anymore. When you do, it's usually with your son or daughter-in-law, and they tend to do most of the talking. I've also noticed that your garden, which used to be your pride and joy, has been completely taken over by landscaping that looks nothing like your previous style." Each observation felt like a small electric shock. She had been watching. She had been noticing. She knew something was wrong. "I've also noticed," she continued, "that your son and daughter-in-law drive very nice, very new cars, while you haven't had a car in the driveway for over 2 years now. And in my experience, when I see patterns like that..." She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air between us. "Patterns like what?" I whispered. "Margaret, can I ask you something? And will you give me an honest answer?" I nodded, though my hands had started to tremble. "When was the last time you made a decision about your own life without consulting your son and daughter-in-law? When was the last time you went somewhere alone, bought something you wanted, or even chose what to have for dinner?" The question hit me like a physical blow, because I couldn't answer it. I literally could not remember the last time I had made an independent choice about anything that mattered. I started, then stopped. "They take very good care of me. I'm sure they do," Ellie said gently. "But that's not what I asked." We sat in silence for a long moment. Then, so quietly I wasn't sure she could hear me, I said, "I can't remember when you last made your own choices. Can't remember who I used to be, I whispered, and saying it out loud made something crack open inside my chest. I used to run a library. I used to make decisions for dozens of people every day. I used to have opinions about books and politics, and what to have for lunch. I used to matter? You still matter, Margaret? Ellie said firmly. You matter right now, sitting here, talking to me. You matter as much today as you did when you ran that library. Then why don't I feel like it? Ellie was quiet for a moment, then said, Margaret, I'm going to tell you something. And I want you to really hear me. What you're describing, the gradual loss of independence, the isolation from friends, the financial control, the way your family makes decisions for you and then tells you it's for your own good, these are classic signs of elder abuse. Elder abuse. The words hung in the air like a diagnosis I'd been waiting 4 years to hear. No, I said automatically. They love me. They're taking care of me. They moved in to help me after Robert died. I believe they love you, Ellie said. But Margaret, love and abuse aren't mutually exclusive. People can genuinely believe they're helping while still causing tremendous harm. And sometimes people use love as an excuse to take what they want. I thought about the credit card charges, the way Susan's eyes had flickered when I found that bank statement, the expensive clothes David wore despite being unemployed, the way they spoke to my doctor as if I weren't there. But they said my memory was getting worse, I said weakly. They said I couldn't be trusted to make good decisions anymore. Margaret, how old are you? 62. 62 is not 92. There's nothing wrong with your mind that I can see. You're having a perfectly coherent conversation with me right now. You remember details about your past, you can analyze situations, you can express complex emotions. Does that sound like someone whose memory can't be trusted? For the first time in years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: validation. Someone else was seeing what I was seeing, questioning what I'd been told to accept. What if you're wrong, I asked. What if they really are just trying to help me? Then let's test that theory, Ellie said. Try making a decision for yourself. Something small, see how they react. Like what? Like coming to have coffee with me tomorrow morning. Like going to the library by yourself. Like calling an old friend, something that any independent adult should be able to do without permission. The idea terrified me. What if they get angry? Margaret, Ellie said gently. If they get angry at you for having coffee with a neighbor, what does that tell you about whether they're really acting in your best interest? I stared at my hands, trying to process what she was saying. Part of me wanted to argue, to defend David and Susan, to insist that she was wrong. But a bigger part of me, a part that had been buried under years of doubt and control, was starting to remember what it felt like to think for myself. I'm scared, I admitted. Of course you are. You've been taught to be scared of your own judgment for 4 years. But Margaret, you were competent enough to run a library for decades. You were competent enough to raise a son and maintain a marriage and a household. You didn't suddenly become incompetent at 62. You've been made to feel incompetent. There's a big difference. Just then, I heard Susan's car pulling into the driveway. Panic shot through me like electricity. I have to go inside, I said, starting to stand. Margaret, wait. Ellie pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket and pressed it into my hand. This is my phone number. If you ever want to talk, if you ever need someone to listen, if you ever need help, call me. Anytime, day or night. I clutched the paper like a lifeline as Susan's car door slammed. Promise me you'll think about what I said, Ellie whispered urgently. Promise me you'll consider that you deserve to make your own choices about your own life. I promise, I whispered back, tucking the paper deep into my pocket, just as Susan appeared around the corner of the house. Mom Chen! There you are. I was worried when I didn't find you inside. Susan's voice was bright and cheerful, but her eyes were sharp as they flicked between me and Ellie. I see you've met our neighbor. Just having a lovely chat, Ellie said pleasantly, standing up. Margaret was telling me about her days working at the library. What an impressive career she had. Something flickered across Susan's face. Annoyance maybe, or calculation. Yes, well, those days are long behind her now. Mom Chen, you should come inside. You've been out here quite a while, and you know how easily you get tired. I wasn't tired. I felt more awake than I had in months. But I stood up anyway, because that's what I'd been trained to do. It was lovely meeting you properly, Eleanor, I said, and was surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. The pleasure was all mine, Margaret. I hope we can do this again soon, As I walked toward the house, Susan's hand guiding me at the elbow like I was an invalid, I could feel Ellie watching. For the first time in years, I didn't feel completely alone. That night, lying in bed, I pulled out Ellie's phone number and stared at it by the light of my bedside lamp. Elder abuse. The words kept echoing in my mind. Was that really what this was? Was I really a victim? Or was I just a confused old woman who couldn't accept that she needed help? But as I thought about everything Ellie had said, about the questions she'd asked that I couldn't answer, about the way my heart had lifted when someone finally saw me as a whole person, rather than a problem to be solved, I began to consider a possibility that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. What if I wasn't crazy? What if I wasn't incompetent? What if I was exactly who I'd always been, just trapped in a situation designed to make me forget that? What if it was time to remember? The first act of rebellion in 4 years was making myself a cup of tea. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? A 62-year-old woman being proud of making her own tea. But when you've been told for years that you might burn yourself, might forget and leave the stove on, might make a mess that someone else will have to clean up, even boiling water becomes an act of defiance. It was the morning after my conversation with Ellie. Susan had gone to her weekly nail appointment, another $75 expense that somehow fit into our tight budget, and David was still asleep. For the first time in months, I was completely alone in my own kitchen. I stood there for a long moment, looking at my stove like it was a foreign object. When had I become afraid of my own appliances? When had I started believing that I was too incompetent to safely heat water? But I turned on the burner, filled the kettle, and waited for it to whistle. And when it did, when I poured the hot water over my tea bag and watched the steam rise from my favorite mug, the one with the library logo that Susan had put away for safekeeping, months ago, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like myself. The tea tasted like freedom. I was still sitting at the kitchen table, savoring every sip, when David stumbled in wearing yesterday's clothes and looking like he hadn't slept well. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, heading straight for the coffee pot. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, and my voice sounded different to my own ears. Stronger, somehow. David poured his coffee and turned to look at me, and something in his expression changed. "You made tea?" "Yes, I did. Susan usually makes your tea for you." "I know. But I wanted to make it myself this morning." He stared at me for a moment, and I could see him processing this small deviation from the routine they'd established for me. "You should have waited for Susan to come back. What if you'd burned yourself?" "I've been making tea for 40 years, David. I think I can manage." The words came out more sharply than I'd intended, and David's eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't need to get snippy, Mom. We just worry about you." "I'm not being snippy. I'm being independent." "Independent." He said the word like it tasted bad. "Mom, we've talked about this. Independence at your age isn't always safe. It's not always smart." There it was again. At your age. That phrase that had become the lock on every door in my life. But this time, instead of shrinking, I felt something spark inside me. 62 isn't ancient, David. I'm not a child who needs supervision to make tea. David set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Maybe not, but your judgment hasn't been great lately. Making impulsive decisions. Doing things without thinking them through." "Like what?" I asked, and I could hear the challenge in my own voice. "Like sitting outside talking to strangers for over an hour yesterday." Strangers. He meant Ellie. My neighbor of 10 years was a stranger because I'd never been allowed to get to know her. Eleanor isn't a stranger. She's our neighbor? She's someone you don't know. Asking personal questions about our family. That's exactly the kind of situation where your judgment concerns me. I stared at my son, and for a moment I saw him clearly. Not as the boy I'd raised. Not as the man who claimed to be protecting me, but as someone who was threatened by the idea of me having any connections outside of his control. "She wasn't asking personal questions," I said carefully. "She was being friendly. She was asking why you don't garden anymore. She was asking about your social life. Those are personal questions, Mom." How did he know what we talked about? Had he been listening, watching from the window? "She was making conversation," I said. "That's what neighbors do. That's what nosy neighbors do when they want to get into other people's business." David's voice was getting sharper. "Mom, you're too trusting. You always have been. You don't see when people have ulterior motives." "What ulterior motives could Ellie possibly have?" "I don't know. Maybe she's lonely and looking for someone to latch onto. Maybe she's one of those people who gets off on inserting themselves into family situations. Maybe she's sizing up the neighborhood for potential victims. Victims. The irony of that word wasn't lost on me. David, you're being paranoid. I'm being protective. His voice rose, and I saw a flash of something ugly in his expression. God, Mom. Sometimes I wonder what would happen to you if Susan and I weren't here. You'd probably invite every con artist and predator in the city into this house. The cruelty of it took my breath away. This wasn't concern, this was control, pure and simple. And for the first time in years I could see the difference. I think you're overreacting, I said quietly. Am I? Remember last year when that man called claiming to be from your bank, and you almost gave him your account information over the phone? I did remember that. But I also remembered that I hadn't given him any information, that I'd hung up and called the bank myself to verify it was a scam. I'd handled it exactly right. But somehow, in David's retelling, it had become evidence of my incompetence rather than my good judgment. I didn't give him any information, I pointed out, only because Susan walked in and stopped you. That wasn't true. That wasn't how it happened at all. But David said it with such conviction that for a moment I doubted my own memory. Was that how it had happened? Or was this another lie designed to make me question myself? I need to get ready for work, David said abruptly. And when Susan gets home, you should probably tell her about your little tea adventure so she knows to keep an eye on you. Keep an eye on me. Like I was a toddler who might stick a fork in an electrical outlet. After David left for his supposed job, I sat in my kitchen and thought about what Ellie had said. Try making a decision for yourself. See how they react. Well, I'd made tea for myself, and David had reacted like I'd announced plans to run away and join the circus. What did that tell me? It told me that Ellie was right. The next test came 2 days later. I decided to walk to the mailbox at the end of our street, something I used to do every day without thinking about it. Where are you going? Susan asked as I reached for the front door handle. To get the mail. Oh, I can get that for you when I go out later? I'd like to get it myself. I need the exercise. Susan's smile looked strained. Mom Chen, it's pretty chilly out there. And the sidewalk might be slippery from the frost this morning. What if you fall? I'll be careful. But what if careful isn't enough? What if you slip anyway? You're not as steady on your feet as you used to be. I looked down at my feet, which seemed perfectly steady to me. I think I can manage to walk to the mailbox, Susan. Of course you can. I'm not saying you can't. I'm just saying, why risk it when I'm happy to do it for you? Because I want to do it myself, I wanted to scream. Because it's my mail in my mailbox and my choice. Because I'm tired of being treated like an invalid. But I just said, I'd really like the fresh air. Susan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Well, if you're determined to go, let me at least come with you. For safety. To walk to the mailbox. Mom Chen, you know how worried we get when you're out alone. What if something happens and we don't know where you are? It was a 30-second walk to the end of the street. But I could see that this was another test, another battle in a war I was only beginning to understand I'd been fighting. Fine, I said, stepping back from the door. You can get it later. The smile that spread across Susan's face was triumphant. Perfect. I'll bring it in when I go to the store this afternoon. But as I watched her walk away, I realized something important. I had seen her true face for just a moment. The mask had slipped, and underneath all that concern and care was someone who was pleased. Actually pleased that she'd stopped me from doing something as simple as getting my own mail. That night, I called Ellie. My hands were shaking as I dialed her number, terrified that David or Susan would hear me, terrified that I was crossing some invisible line I could never uncross. Hello? Ellie, it's Margaret. From next door? Margaret, I'm so glad you called. How are you? I think you might be right about what you said. About the elder abuse. There was a pause, then Ellie's voice, gentle but firmsy. Tell me what happened. So I did. I told her about the tea, about David's reaction, about Susan stopping me from getting my own mail. As I spoke, I could hear how ridiculous it sounded. Grown adults arguing about tea and mailboxes. But Ellie didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss my concerns or tell me I was overreacting. Margaret, she said when I finished, what you're describing is called infantilization. It's when someone treats a competent adult like a helpless child. It's a form of emotional abuse, and it's designed to make you doubt your own capabilities. But what if they're right? What if I really am becoming less capable? Are you less capable of making tea than you were 5 years ago? No. Are you less capable of walking to a mailbox? Note. Are you less capable of having a conversation with a neighbor? No. Then the problem isn't your capability, Margaret. The problem is that other people are benefiting from you believing you're incapable. Benefiting. The word hung in the air between us. You mean financially? I mean in every way. Financially, yes, but also in terms of power and control. Some people like being needed. Some people like being the sole decision maker in someone else's life, and some people. Her voice grew harder. Just like taking what doesn't belong to them. What do? I whispered. You start small. You start reclaiming tiny pieces of your independence, one choice at a time. And you start documenting everything. Every time they tell you that you can't do something, you're perfectly capable of doing. Every financial decision they make without consulting you. Every time they isolate you from other people. Why document it? Because if you ever decide you want your life back, you're going to need proof that you were competent all along. And Margaret, yes, you deserve to have your life back. You deserve to make your own tea and get your own mail and talk to your neighbors. You deserve to be treated like the intelligent, capable woman you are. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my darkened bedroom and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to start fighting back. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But one small act of independence at a time. I was going to reclaim the life that had been stolen from me so gradually I'd barely noticed it was gone. The revolution would begin with tea and mailboxes and conversations with neighbors. But it would end with me remembering who I really was, Margaret Chen, former librarian, widow, independent woman who had every right to live her own life on her own terms. The war for my freedom had begun. And for the first time in 4 years, I believed I could win it. The fall happened on a Wednesday in November. Almost 5 years to the day after David and Susan had moved into my home. Temporarily. I was coming down the stairs carrying a basket of laundry, something I'd been doing for decades without incident, when I missed the bottom step and tumbled forward. It wasn't dramatic. I caught myself with my hands, scraped my palms on the hardwood floor, and bruised my knee. The kind of minor mishap that happens to everyone, regardless of age. But you would have thought I'd fallen off a cliff from the way Susan reacted. "Oh my God, Mom Chen!" she shrieked, rushing over to where I was sitting on the floor, taking inventory of my scrapes. "Are you hurt? Should I call 911? You could have broken your hip." "I'm fine," I said, starting to get up. "It's just a small, don't move," Susan commanded. "You could have internal injuries. You could have hit your head. Come quick." David thundered down the stairs like the house was on fire. "What happened?" "She fell down the stairs. She could have been killed." I wanted to point out that I'd missed one step, not fallen down an entire staircase, but Susan was already calling my doctor's office, insisting on an emergency appointment for a serious fall with possible head trauma. By the time we got to Dr. Martinez's office, with David and Susan flanking me like bodyguards, you would have thought I'd been in a car accident. Susan recounted the incident with such drama that even I started wondering if I'd missed something. "She's been having more falls lately," Susan told Dr. Martinez, which was completely untrue. I hadn't fallen in years. "We're really concerned about her living independently." Dr. Martinez examined me thoroughly. My pupils, my reflexes, my bruised knee and scraped palms. "Everything looks fine," she announced. "No signs of concussion, no serious injury. Just a minor fall with minor scrapes." I felt vindicated. I wanted to say, "I told you I was fine." But Susan wasn't finished. "Doctor, we've been worried about Mom Chen for a while now. Her memory seems to be getting worse, she's been making poor decisions, and now these falls. We're wondering if it might be time to consider some additional safety measures." Dr. Martinez looked at me directly for the first time since we'd arrived. "Mrs. Chen, how are you feeling? Any confusion, dizziness, or memory problems?" I opened my mouth to answer, but David jumped in. "She says she feels fine, but she's been forgetting conversations, getting confused about dates, leaving things on the stove." None of that was true. None of it, but he said it with such conviction, such concern, that I saw Dr. Martinez's expression change as she looked at me. "Mrs. Chen," she prompted again. "I feel fine," I said firmly. "I'm not confused. I don't forget conversations." I missed one step on my own stairs, but I could see in her eyes that she was weighing my word against theirs. 2 against 1, and they sounded so convincing, so worried, so devoted. "Well, Dr. Martinez said finally, let's just keep an eye on things. Minor falls can sometimes be early warning signs of balance issues or other concerns. Make sure someone's with her when she's going up and down stairs from now on. someone with me on my own stairs, in my own house. That night, David and Susan sat me down at the kitchen table for what they called a family meeting. "Mom," David said, his voice heavy with fake regret, "after what happened today, Susan and I have been doing some serious thinking." "It was one missed step," I protested. "It was a wake-up call," Susan corrected. "Mom Chen, you could have been seriously hurt. What if you'd been alone? What if we hadn't been here to help you? I would have gotten up and put ice on my knee, just like I did when you were both children and took tumbles all the time." "That's different, and you know it," David said. "We were young, we bounced back. At your age, a fall can be catastrophic. At your age." Those 3 words that had become the bars of my prison. "Which is why," Susan continued, "we think it's time to make some changes. Some legal changes that will protect you if something like this happens again." "Legal changes?" My blood went cold. "What kind of legal changes?" I asked carefully. David pulled out a folder I'd never seen before and set it on the table between us. "We've been consulting with a lawyer, just to explore options, you understand. And he's drawn up some documents that would give us the legal authority to make decisions for you if you're ever unable to make them yourself." "I am perfectly able to make my own decisions." "Of course you are," Susan said soothingly. "Right now. But what about next time? What if next time you fall and hit your head? What if you have a stroke or develop dementia? What if there comes a day when you can't advocate for yourself? Then we'll deal with it when that day comes." "But by then it might be too late," David said. "Mom, these documents are just a safety net. A way to make sure that if something happens, people who love you and know your wishes can step in immediately." He opened the folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. "This is a power of attorney form. It would give us the legal right to make financial and medical decisions for you if you're ever incapacitated. And this," Susan added, pulling out another document, "is paperwork to add our names to the deed of the house. Just as a precaution so that if something happens to you, there won't be any legal complications with the property." I stared at the papers like they were venomous snakes. Power of attorney. Deed transfer. They were asking me to sign over control of my money, my medical care, and my home. "I don't want to sign these," I said. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly," David said. "Today's fall has you shaken up. You're not seeing the big picture. The big picture is that you're asking me to give up my legal rights." "We're asking you to protect yourself?" Susan's voice rose slightly. Then she caught herself and smiled. "Mom Chen, we love you. We've given up 5 years of our lives to take care of you. All we're asking is that you give us the legal tools to continue taking care of you properly." 5 years. They'd been here 5 years now, not the few months they'd originally promised. And in those 5 years, what exactly had they given up? David hadn't held a steady job. Susan spent money like water and got her nails done every week. They lived rent-free in my house. Ate food bought with my money, drove cars purchased with my credit cards. "What exactly have you given up?" I asked. The question seemed to surprise them. David and Susan exchanged a glance. "Our independence," David said finally. "Our privacy, our own lives. We could have been traveling, pursuing our own interests, building our own wealth. Instead, we've been here, taking care of me, by isolating me from friends, controlling my finances, making me afraid to make my own tea." "I never asked you to give up anything," I said quietly. "You didn't have to ask," Susan said. "We did it out of love, and now we're just asking you to show a little trust in return." Trust. They wanted me to trust them with legal control over every aspect of my life. "I need to think about this," I said. "What's to think about?" David asked, and for the first time, I heard impatience creeping into his voice. "Mom, we're offering to continue taking care of you for the rest of your life. All you have to do is sign a few papers." I said I need to think about it. "How long?" Susan asked. "I don't know. A few days, maybe a week." "Mom," David's voice was harder now. "You're being unreasonable. These are standard documents. Everyone our age has them for their elderly parents." Elderly parents? I was 62 years old. When had I become elderly? Maybe so. But I still want time to consider them. David slammed his hand on the table, making me jump. "Time to consider what? Whether or not you trust your own son. Whether or not you believe we have your best interests at heart." The mask was slipping. I could see anger in his face now, real anger, not the patient concern he usually wore. "David, please don't yell at me." "I'm not yelling, I'm frustrated." "We've spent 5 years taking care of you, and the moment we ask for a simple gesture of trust, you act like we're trying to steal from you." "But they were trying to steal from me." That's exactly what they were trying to do. I just need some time, I repeated. Fine, Susan said, her voice cold. Take your time, but Mom Chen, I want you to think about something while you're considering whether or not you trust us. She leaned forward, her eyes hard. What do you think happens if we decide we can't do this anymore? What happens if we decide that caring for someone who doesn't appreciate us, doesn't trust us, is too much of a burden? The threat was clear. Sign the papers or lose the only family you have left. Are you saying you'd leave? I asked. We're saying that no one can be expected to sacrifice forever for someone who treats their help like an attack. David said. I looked at my son, my baby boy who I'd rocked to sleep, who I'd taught to ride a bike, who I'd sent care packages to in college, and saw a stranger who was threatening to abandon me if I didn't sign over my life to him. I see, I said quietly. We hope you do, Susan said. We really hope you do. That night alone in my room I pulled out Ellie's phone number with shaking hands. Ellie, I whispered when she answered. They want me to sign papers. Power of attorney and the deed to my house. There was a pause. Then, Margaret, listen to me very carefully. Do not sign anything. Do you understand me? Do not sign a single document. They're threatening to leave if I don't. Let them leave. But what if they're right? What if I can't take care of myself anymore? Margaret, this afternoon you called me with a clear, coherent plan. You're managing this conversation perfectly right now. There is nothing wrong with your mind. They're using your own love and fear against you. What do I do? Tomorrow, when they're both out of the house, you call me. And we're going to start making some calls of our own. What kind of calls? The kind that are going to help you get your life back. After I hung up, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, I would have to choose between the familiar prison I'd grown accustomed to and the terrifying freedom of fighting for my own life. For 5 years, I had been slowly disappearing. Tomorrow I would start becoming visible again. The thought terrified me, but not as much as the thought of signing those papers and disappearing completely. The morning I decided to take my life back started like any other morning in my prison. Susan made me weak coffee and dry toast. David complained about how tired he was from working so hard at his part-time job, and I sat quietly at my own kitchen table, pretending to be the helpless old woman they needed me to be. But inside, I was planning a revolution. At exactly 10:30 a.m., after both David and Susan had left the house, David for his supposed job, Susan for her weekly massage, I called Ellie. I'm ready, I said when she answered. I'm ready to fight back. Good for you, Margaret. I'll be right over. Ellie arrived within minutes, carrying a notebook and a determined expression that reminded me why I'd liked her immediately. First things first, she said, settling at my kitchen table. We need to document everything. Every form of abuse, every financial irregularity, every time they've prevented you from making your own decisions. Can you do that? For the next 2 hours, I told Ellie everything. Every credit card charge I hadn't authorized. Every time they'd prevented me from seeing friends or going places alone. Every occasion when they'd answered questions for me at doctor's appointments. Every instance when they'd made me feel incompetent, confused, or dependent. As I spoke, Ellie took careful notes, and slowly, a pattern emerged that was impossible to deny: systematic financial, emotional, and psychological abuse spanning 5 years. Margaret, Ellie said when I finished, what you've just described is textbook elder abuse. Financial exploitation, isolation, psychological manipulation, and coercive control. But they'll say I'm confused. They'll say I don't remember things correctly. That's why we're going to gather evidence, Ellie said firmly. Do you have access to any of your financial records? I shook my head. Susan keeps everything in their bedroom. Then we'll get copies from the bank. Do you have your social security number memorized? Of course. Your mother's maiden name, the answers to security questions? Yes, all of it. Ellie smiled. They may have isolated you, Margaret, but they couldn't steal your identity completely. You're still you, and you still have rights. The first call was to my bank. With Ellie's help, I requested copies of all my statements for the past 5 years. The customer service representative was helpful and sympathetic, especially when I explained that I was an elder abuse victim trying to document financial exploitation. The second call was to the elder abuse hotline that Ellie had researched. The woman who answered, Linda, was kind but direct. Mrs. Chen, what you're describing is serious criminal behavior. Financial exploitation of an elderly person is a felony in this state. Are you in immediate physical danger? No, but they're pressuring me to sign legal documents that would give them complete control over my finances and property. Do not sign anything. Do you have somewhere safe you could go if you need to leave quickly? I looked at Ellie, who nodded. Yes, I do. Good. I'm going to connect you with Adult Protective Services and give you the number for a legal aid attorney who specializes in elder abuse cases. We're going to help you get your life back, Mrs. Chen. The third call was to legal aid. Attorney Sarah Johnson agreed to see me that afternoon. This is moving very fast, I said to Ellie as we prepared to leave for the legal aid office. It has to move fast, she replied. The longer you wait, the more time they have to pressure you, manipulate you, or potentially forge your signature on those documents. We need to establish legal protection for you immediately. Sarah Johnson was about 40, with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen too much injustice. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or details. Mrs. Chen, she said when I finished, I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need honest answers. Are you currently experiencing any significant memory loss, confusion, or cognitive impairment? No. Do you understand the nature of financial documents like power of attorney and property deeds? Yes. I worked in a public library for 20 years. I helped people understand legal documents regularly. Do you believe you're competent to make your own financial and medical decisions? Absolutely. Then, let's talk about your options. Sarah explained that I could file for a restraining order preventing David and Susan from coercing me to sign documents. I could also begin eviction proceedings, since they had no legal right to live in my home indefinitely. But they're my family, I said weakly. Mrs. Chen, family members who exploit and abuse elderly relatives aren't acting like family. They're acting like criminals. And you have every right to protect yourself from criminals, regardless of your relationship to them. By the time we returned to my house that evening, I had legal representation, documentation of the abuse, and a plan. I also had something I hadn't felt in 5 years: hope. David and Susan were both home when Ellie and I walked through the front door. Their expressions when they saw us together were priceless. Surprise, annoyance, and something that looked suspiciously like panic. Mom Chen, Susan said carefully, where have you been? We were worried when you weren't here. I was taking care of some business, I said, and my voice sounded stronger than it had in years. What kind of business? David asked. I looked at my son. This man who had spent 5 years systematically destroying my independence and self-worth, and felt something I hadn't felt in decades: righteous anger. The kind of business that competent adults handle, I said calmly. Legal business. The color drained from David's face. Legal business? I set my purse down on the kitchen table, and faced them both. I know what you've been doing, I said quietly. I know about the credit card charges I never authorized. I know about the bank withdrawals I never made. I know that you've been lying to me about my memory, my capabilities, my judgment. I know that you've isolated me from friends and prevented me from making my own decisions for 5 years. Mom, you're confused, David started. I am not confused. The words came out louder than I'd intended, and for a moment, all 3 of them stared at me. I am not confused, I am not incompetent, and I am not signing those papers. Susan's mask finally slipped completely. Fine, she said, her voice cold and hard. Fine, Mom Chen. You want to handle everything yourself. You want to reject the people who've sacrificed everything for you. Then maybe it's time we stop sacrificing. Maybe it is, I said. You can't take care of yourself, David said desperately. Mom, you'll end up in a nursing home within 6 months. Then that's my choice to make. You're making a huge mistake, Susan said. When you fall again, when you have a medical emergency, when you can't remember how to pay your bills, don't come crying to us. I won't, I said. Because I'm not going to fall, I'm not going to have a medical emergency from normal aging. And I've been paying bills since before you were born. They stared at me like I was a stranger, and I realized that in a way, I was. They'd never known the real Margaret Chen, the competent, independent woman who had raised David, who had managed a library, who had navigated decades of adult responsibilities. They'd only known the diminished version of me that they'd spent 5 years creating. We'll leave, David said finally. If that's what you want, we'll leave. It is what I want. Fine. But don't expect us to come running back when you realize you can't manage alone. I don't expect anything from you, I said, and for the first time in years, that was completely true. It took them 3 days to pack their belongings and move out. 3 days during which they tried every manipulation tactic they'd perfected over the years. Guilt, intimidation, false concern, and veiled threats. But with Ellie's support and my lawyer's guidance, I stood firm. On the morning they left, David tried one last appeal. "Mom," he said, standing in my doorway with his suitcases, "I know you think we were trying to hurt you, but we weren't. We love you. Everything we did was because we love you." I looked at my son, and for a moment I saw the little boy I'd raised. The child who'd come to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. Part of me wanted to forgive everything, to pretend the last 5 years hadn't happened, to let them stay and continue taking care of me. But then I remembered the credit card bills, the isolation, the way they'd made me doubt my own mind. I remembered sitting in my own kitchen, afraid to make myself a cup of tea. "David," I said gently, "if this was love, then I don't want to be loved this way anymore." He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "You'll regret this, Mom. You'll regret it, and it'll be too late." But he was wrong. I didn't regret it for a single moment. Epilogue: 2 years later, I'm sitting in my garden as I finish telling you this story. My garden, which I replanted myself last spring with flowers I chose, arranged the way I wanted them. The roses Robert planted are blooming again. It turns out they just needed someone who knew how to properly care for them. I'm 64 now, and I live alone in my house on Maple Street. I make my own tea, get my own mail, drive my own car. Yes, I bought a car, and make every decision about my own life. I rejoined my book club. Helen welcomed me back with tears in her eyes and a stack of books I'd missed. I volunteer at the library twice a week, helping people research legal documents and community resources, especially seniors who might be facing what I faced. Ellie and I have coffee together every Tuesday morning. We've become the kind of friends I thought I'd never have again, the kind who know all your stories and love you anyway. I never heard from David or Susan again after they left. I sent David a birthday card last year, but it was returned unopened. I'm sad about that, but I'm not devastated. I learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, and I am neither. My finances recovered quickly once I stopped funding 2 additional adults' lifestyles. The credit card debt was eliminated within 8 months. I have a financial advisor now, someone I chose, someone who answers to me. My health is excellent. Turns out there was nothing wrong with my memory, my balance, or my judgment. Amazing how much better you feel when you're not constantly being told you're incompetent. I want to end by saying this to anyone who might be listening and recognizing their own story in mine. You are not crazy. You are not incompetent. You are not too old, too confused, or too dependent to deserve respect and autonomy. If someone is making decisions for you that you're capable of making yourself, that's not love, that's control. If someone is spending your money without your permission, that's not help, that's theft. If someone is isolating you from friends and activities you enjoy, that's not protection, that's abuse. You deserve better. You deserve to live your own life. Make your own choices, and be treated with dignity regardless of your age. And if you're ready to fight for that life, there are people who will help you. Start with one phone call, one conversation with a trusted neighbor, a social worker, a legal aid attorney, or an elder abuse hotline. Your life is still your own. You just have to be brave enough to claim it. I'm Margaret Chen. I suffered in silence for 5 years, but I found my voice. And if I can do it at 62, anyone can do it at any age. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it helps you find your own courage. The revolution starts with a single cup of tea you make for yourself, in your own kitchen, because you deserve to make your own tea. It starts with remembering who you are underneath all the lies you've been told about who you're supposed to be. It starts with choosing freedom. Even when freedom feels scarier than the familiar prison, your life is waiting for you to reclaim it. What are you waiting for?